Welcome to Wisconsin in Focus. I'm JD Davidson. The state of Wisconsin is spending more on students now than it did a decade ago. But the question is, what are taxpayers getting to show for the extra money? The Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty analyzed the latest spending information from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. And joining us today is Ben Yount, Wisconsin contributor for the Center Square. Ben, what did Will have to say about the extra money and education spending in general?
There is a common, I don't want to say myth, that's the word that Will used. I don't want to say trope because that paints it in a negative light. There is a common perception, a talking point among Democrats in Wisconsin that public schools in the state have been underfunded for decades. Almost any time there's a conversation about a state budget, almost any time there's a conversation about test scores, almost any time there's a conversation like the conversation that's happening here this summer, as more and more schools are deciding to go to voters to ask for tax increases to do things like pay their payroll or build brand new swimming pools and field houses. There is a refrain from Democrats in Wisconsin that, well, if the state would simply just properly fund our schools, we wouldn't have to do this. And the numbers come from the state. This is not the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty doing its own research and coming to its own conclusions. No, these are the numbers from the state of Wisconsin. This is not the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty coming up with its own calculations. DPI put out a report during the middle of the Republican National Convention, by the way, that listed just how much money was spent. And the state itself says that schools, on average, are spending $17,697 per student. Now, these are 2022 numbers because there's always that data lag. It's down a little bit from the peak in 2020 when there was billions of extra dollars in federal coronavirus money. But you got to remember that's $1,000 more than what schools were spending in 2011. And before you ask, yes, these are inflation adjusted numbers. So this is an apples to apples comparison. And just one more apples to apples comparison. The average per student spending in Wisconsin's public schools, K through 12, the most expensive college tuition in Wisconsin, $9,724 per year. That's at UW-Madison. So it's almost twice as much to educate a K through 12 student as it is to educate a University of Wisconsin student for a single year. And that shows, as Will puts, as Will Flanders with the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty told us, that puts this claim that somehow Wisconsin public schools are underfunded into the proper context.
So it's easily seen that there's, those schools or public schools are spending $1,000 more than what they were a decade ago. What's the bang for the taxpayer's buck?
Well, if you want to measure with test scores, it's flat. If you want to measure with graduation rates, it's largely flat. In some school districts, graduation rates have gone down. Don't forget, Milwaukee public schools are graduating maybe 70% of their kids on time. And Milwaukee's public schools have one of the worst truancy rates in the state of Wisconsin. And Milwaukee public schools have the worst racial education gap in the entire country. Schools in Baltimore and schools in New Orleans do better when it comes to comparing how white kids do on tests and black kids than Milwaukee. So what's the bang for the buck? Not very good. The numbers do show that student enrollment is down. Some of it's a demographic bubble. There just simply are fewer kids going through school, fewer school-aged kids than there were a decade ago. But Will does make mention that part of the enrollment drop is the growth in enrollment in school choice. More and more parents are choosing to take their kids out of Wisconsin public schools because despite spending almost $18,000 per kid, you're exactly right. A lot of parents don't think there's a bang for their buck, and a lot of parents see that their kids just aren't where they should be when it comes to reading or writing or math or science or civics or any of the other classes that usually don't show up on standardized tests.
The enrollment figures are one thing. This is an examination of spending per student. not overall spending, which we can talk about enrollment and all of that when we get to that. But I feel like this refrain of schools being underfunded or not, I hear this a lot, not fairly funded, is going on all across the country. And I believe it's been going on for decades and decades and decades. The idea of spending more money doesn't automatically get you great results, which is what we've seen with Will's analysis here. But I see this around the country. It's possibly money will help, but using the money in certain situations or using the money more wisely might be better.
If you go back to the 1970s, you can follow the line that tracks American student performance, and it's remained largely flat. Couple of bumps up, couple of bumps down. COVID, when they closed the schools, erased a year or two, and that really hurt kids. But similarly, you can track the line of spending, and it is just a moonshot, straight up in some cases. And so you're right. If money was the issue, and I've heard this from education reformers from years. I've heard this from some of the most pro-school choice Republicans that you could find in any state capital. And they say, if it was only so simple that if we just spent this much money, then our kids would learn. States would say, all right, what is it? 20 grand? Bam, done. Thank you. Educate the kids. Let's move on. But it's not. There is no magic number. And not to get to too political of a point, but when you ask teachers unions, when you ask Democrats who are always saying we need more, we need more, we need more, when you say, well, how much more? What else would you like for taxpayers to pay for? They don't have an answer. And this is probably not for this podcast, but you also have to look at where the growth is. That not all of this money is going to classroom teachers. Some of it is. There's an awful lot of money that's going towards administrators, people who have, reading coaches kind of jobs. But there are also people who have to work at the district office now because they've got to track all manners of things. And so, yes, when you break down, here's how much the district has, here how many kids we have, simple division, bing, bang, boom, here's your number. That doesn't necessarily measure classroom spending. And that also doesn't measure, like you said, the targeted classroom spending. Some schools you can show up, kids are on their way to college, great, wonderful, fantastic. Other schools you're going to have to work to get kids across that graduation stage. And that's where you don't have any of that information in just a simple snapshot of what's the average that schools in Wisconsin are spending.
Sure. It's very interesting. Ben, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.